China now has a very strong indigenous arms industry, which is not so reliant. They still buy a lot of kit from Russia, but it's not nearly as reliant as it used to be. But yes, they're very keen to see the way this kit performs in action. I mean, they'll be pouring all over the India-Pakistan scrap recently because to see the performance of Russian missiles and aircraft in that conflict. But in a sense that the Ukraine conflict provides an even broader test bed for weaponry which the PLA either has or has taken and redeveloped, redesigned, and scaled up, improved for its own purposes.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're very privileged to be talking to Ian Williams. Ian is an award-winning foreign correspondent and author who has spent many years reporting from the front lines in Ukraine and Russia, but he specialises in uncovering human stories behind the conflict and dissecting the complex information war different countries around the world are engaged in. You know, not just the Kremlin, but also Southeast Asia and China in particular. And your work offers crucial ground-level perspective on the reality of war behind the headlines. And you've just released the paperback version of your book, Vampire State: The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Ian, welcome back to Frontline.
A pleasure to be here again.
Well, it's great to be in, but you know, we'll talk about China in a moment. United States envoy Steve Witkoff has just arrived in Moscow and is going to try and persuade Vladimir Putin or test the waters with Vladimir Putin as to whether he's going to come to the peace negotiating table before Donald Trump's revamp of the deadline from the 2nd of September to this Friday. Before he brings in secondary sanctions or whatever he decides to bring in if Putin doesn't come to the peace table. Do you think Witkoff's going to achieve anything?
I doubt it. It's curious timing for the visit because, after all, Putin has pretty much rebuffed everything that's been suggested to him and has made it clear in his words and actions that he's not particularly interested in anything other than Ukrainian capitulation in order to end the war. So I'm not entirely clear what sort of message Witkoff is carrying with him to Putin and whether Putin takes the deadlines, takes the threats, takes the warnings very seriously. The word that seems to be emerging from Moscow is that he doesn't think secondary sanctions will work and can be imposed. And here, of course, we're talking about oil, essentially, and whether or not Trump would penalise India and China for buying Russian oil with 100% tariffs is something he's floated. Putin doesn't appear to take that seriously. There's also a suggestion America may go after Russia's shadow oil fleet. But I think from past visits by the envoy and the words he's spoken, which have tended to echo a lot of the talking points of Putin, I can't see what this will achieve. And then the question is, will Trump really follow through on more robust support for Ukraine and more robust sanctions against Russia?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Steve Witkoff's not a diplomat, and Vladimir Putin is a past master at playing very experienced diplomats. And I understand the last time he had a meeting with Putin, he didn't even bring in American interpreters with him. He relied on Putin's provided Kremlin interpreters, which is not something that you would ordinarily do. And I think, again, we see that both China and India seem to have dismissed these secondary tariffs and have said that they're going to continue to buy Russian oil because that's in their economic interests. Has Trump lost his threats before he's even managed to bring them in?
It seems that way, and this really is a test. I mean, is he seriously going to follow this through? I mean, what does he do now? Does he throw in the towel and say, I've had enough with this whole process, which is effectively abandoning Ukraine? Or does he seriously up the ante? I doubt the secondary sanctions, the secondary tariffs against India and China will work for multiple reasons. As you point out, Witkoff is a property developer. He's not a seasoned diplomat. He has made what many diplomats regard as being quite serious missteps in the whole way he has handled Russia, handling a Russian president and a Russian system where duplicity, manipulation is deeply ingrained, inherited from the former Soviet Union. These people know how to play naive envoys. And I think that Witkoff in many ways is out of his depth in this, and I can't see his visit really achieving a great deal. The question therefore becomes, what does Trump do? Does he follow through on the threats he's made?
Well, I think he's going to have to be seen to be doing something, but it's interesting that China and India have dismissed this, and you've described that the Russia-China relationship as a marriage of convenience in the past. What is the current state? How reliant is China on getting natural resources from Russia, and what state is the Chinese economy really in?
That is a fundamental question. I mean, China is trying to present its economy at the moment as being quite resilient, as being technologically close to, if not surpassing, the United States in many ways. It's trying to big up the state of its economy. I think that a lot of that is deception. I think there's a lot that's quite Potemkin about the way China is presenting its technological prowess at the moment. That's not to dismiss the achievements they've made, but I do question just how sustainable they are and whether that does mean that China has created a sort of innovation-driven economy which is self-sustaining. But on the Russian side, clearly it's useful to Russia, to China, to have access to raw materials, minerals, oil, gas at well below market prices, and they have struck very good deals from a Chinese perspective with the Russians in order to get access to this. I think that China benefits in numerous ways from this relationship, from the fact that it makes China immensely the stronger partner, because Russia is very, very dependent upon China. In fact, I would go far as say, China is underwriting the Ukraine war, and Russia would not be able to sustain that war without the support of China. And I think as China has hinted in talks, in fact, with the EU, they don't want to see Russia defeated.
Yes.
Interpret that as you will, but one way of looking at that is it does suit Beijing rather well to have America, to have Europe engaged in this conflict within Europe, because it distracts attention away from the Pacific, and it distracts attention away from anything that China might choose to do around Taiwan. So it does benefit Beijing to have Trump, to have Brussels, to have London distracted in this way.
But do you think there are limits to where China's support is going to be? There has to be a line in the sand somewhere that they've decided they won't cross that, because the implications then of the West then taking action against China, especially economic action against China, would be too great. And if Russia is so dependent on China, what's Russia mortgaging? Is China then in a position to call that debt in at some stage in the future? I
think there are those in Moscow who are asking that question and are quite concerned about the implications further down the line. I mean, we have seen some intriguing leaks, notably to the US media, to the New York Times, of allegedly FSB, Russian intelligence agency, documents suggesting that China is up to all sorts of espionage and spying within Russia, which should come as no real surprise. Yeah. But the surprise is that documentation like that was actually leaked. But since then, there have been reports of Chinese military embedded with the Russians, not to fight with them, but to observe the way weaponry is being used, to observe the tactics on the ground, because there's quite a lot in common between the Russian military and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and the way they conduct military operations in the weaponry. So China is very keen to see the way that stuff is working and to see the way the tactics are working or not. It has been the case, of course, that there have been some pretty major blunders by by the Russians. And China's keen to learn from this, and that would be at the root of the espionage that they've been conducting against Russia. But it does suggest that the Russians have now suggested that maybe it's better to actually invite them in so they can see for themselves the way the weapons are working and the way the military tactics are working out. It's intriguing as well that they continue to have military exercises together in different parts of the world. There was a recent
naval exercise.
Yeah, and these are intriguing because they've been growing in scale and in geographic range. I mean, the Iranians were also part of them at some point, although perhaps they're preoccupied at the moment. But military experts will tell you that there's something quite performative about these exercises because there's no real interoperability, is the word they use in sort of military circles, as exists, say, with NATO or between the Americans and the Koreans or the Americans and the Japanese, whereby the systems are much more closely integrated. Russia and China essentially are having these exercises, but with two very separate systems and with very little integration of the sort you would need if you were seriously planning to fight a war or a battle together. So again, that's a nod towards the limitations.
No, that's fascinating because the deployment of the British aircraft carrier group around HMS Prince of Wales, and that's been doing exercises with a number of the different navies from Southeast Asia and Australia and elsewhere, and it's got a multinational task group supporting it, as it's in there. It's all about interoperability. And people talk about NATO and NATO being a defensive alliance. In reality, it's an interoperability alliance so that you can have your procedures together. But if you look at the way China trains and Russia trains, it's very scripted. It's almost like it's a play on the stage and you're told what to do, when to fire, where to fire it at, and stop, and it gets good pictures and everything else.
Exactly. I think it's essentially performative. And if you look also at, say, the Five Eyes, the cyber alliance, Canada, the US, New Zealand, UK
and Australia.
This is unprecedented in the degree of intelligence sharing and know-how sharing. I think there's rarely been anything quite like that historically. And while we've seen a degree of convergence between the way that Russia and China uses their cyber power in everything from sabotage, espionage to information operations, there's no evidence of a degree of, yes, there's been some cooperation, say, on information operations, but there's very little, shall we say, further evidence of coordination or cooperation because the cybersphere is somewhere where trust is in very short supply. Whereas, I say, and you contrast that with the Five Eyes, which is built upon a sort of deep-seated trust that is very rare in international alliances. And so, yes, this has been described as a no-limits partnership between Russia and China, but when you start to pick at it, you start to dig into it a little bit further, there are real serious limits, suspicions, mutual concerns, which I think would be a real obstacle to any sort of firmly taking action together.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. But the People's Liberation Army was very much equipped with, in the early days, Soviet-style equipment. And it's in a big remodernization program, but a lot of the redesigns are based on the old Soviet designs. And given the very poor performance of the Russian kit in Ukraine, do you think the People's Liberation Army are concerned, which is why, and do you think they're using the opportunities with the relationship with Russia to beta test their own designs on the front line against Ukraine just to see how it performs?
I think there's an element of that. I mean, there was the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, amid the chaos in Russia in the early 90s, the Chinese took huge advantage of that in terms of buying up Russian know-how, importing Russian experts, all manner of espionage. I mean, they were there plundering, picking away at the carcass of the former Soviet Union in terms of whatever expertise and military know-how they could get their hands on. And of course, China now has a very strong indigenous arms industry, which is not so reliant. They still buy a lot of kit from Russia, but it's not nearly as reliant as it used to be. But yes, they're very keen to see the way this kit performs in action. I mean, they'll be pouring all over the India-Pakistan scrap recently, because to see the performance of Russian missiles and aircraft in that conflict. But in a sense that the Ukraine conflict provides an even broader test bed for weaponry which the PLA either has or has taken and redeveloped, redesigned, and scaled up, improved for its own purposes.
Yeah, and then they can test it against Western systems, albeit quite ancient Western systems, but it gives them that test bed. The other interesting country in Southeast Asia that has got a direct link into Ukraine is North Korea. And Russia's relying on North Korea for 40%, 60% of its ammunition. A lot of long-range missiles. We're starting to see equipment coming in, all the rest of it. You also mentioned the cyber environment. From what I understand, there are 2 internet pipelines into North Korea. One comes from Beijing, that's been there for many, many years, and is relatively low bandwidth. The other comes from Moscow and was provided by the Russian National Railway Company and is very high bandwidth. And just after that was put in, Kim Jong-un's missile program went from being more unreliable than reliable, let's put it that way, to being very reliable most of the time. Do you think both states are using Kim Jong-un, North Korea, as a plausibly deniable little bad boy to do some stirring for them, both in the region, but also then Russia's clearly reliant on North Korea for an awful lot of support?
I think certainly. I mean, North Korea, there is mutual suspicion because China has long regarded North Korea as a buffer state against the West. So there will be suspicion in Beijing about Russia getting closer to North Korea, especially with soldiers fighting for the Russians on the front lines in Ukraine, North Korean weaponry. On the cyber front, there's been a suggestion that the Chinese have been facilitating North Korea's hackers, who, when you consider the size of the country and the relative backwardness technologically, at least away from the military, their cyber element is actually pretty good. They're pretty strong. And there's been a lot of suggestions that this has been facilitated by servers in China. And of course, recently, one of the big scams that has emerged is rather than hacking into systems, North Koreans have been posing as freelance IT specialists, apparently based in other parts of the world, and are being employed by Western tech companies under false identities. And so immediately, of course, if you are an employee, you get inside the firewall, you're within the system. And so who needs to hack your way in when you're invited in and you become a freelance tech expert employed by a big company that thinks you're perhaps sitting in London or Berlin or Paris, whereas actually you're in Pyongyang hoovering up everything you can from within that system. So the cyber assets of the North Koreans are quite significant. And I think that China has been very instrumental in facilitating that. And I think that the Russian link now is much closer and stronger than it was. And North Korea has become a very significant player in this. But again, a divisive one potentially between Beijing and Moscow.
Well, it's interesting. What you've described there is North Korea effectively hacking humans, and I've been saying to chief information security officers for years when I talk about cyber in different lectures that I'm not bothered about hacking a network. I'll hack the people that can get into the network, and North Korea are showing how to do that. But getting back to the potential for economic sanctions coming in this Friday, do you think the Chinese economic model could withstand a massive increase in Western sanctions if Donald Trump was serious and started to put 100% tariffs on China, whether it's everything out of China or just Chinese companies that are doing business with Russia?
I think they would be struggling. I think, to me, it's significant that a lot of the trade agreements that China has been signing with third countries, Vietnam is a prime example, so is the UK, there have been provisions within those trade agreements about security, about China. Sometimes China's not mentioned by name, but the implication is pretty clear. Look, you've got to be wary of China. The bigger picture here is to try and exclude China from sensitive supply chains and access to top-end technology. In the case of Vietnam, China has boasted that its dependence on the US market has been reduced. They were preparing for the trade war. They say the amount of exports to the US fell to like 15, 16% this year against 20% 5 years ago. But that's been achieved to some extent by redirecting through third countries. Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, for instance, has been on the receiving end of a lot of Chinese investment. Now, a good proportion of that are either screwdriver factories in that they're assembling components brought in from China, or they are in many cases just relabeling them as made in Thailand, made in Vietnam, made in Malaysia. And the individual governments in those countries are very aware of this and very sensitive to it, and they're worried that they could become targets as a result of it. And they've now become much more vigilant about the incoming Chinese investment. But it's pretty clear that the Trump administration wants to target that redirection of Chinese exports, and that in their agreements with the UK, and it's implicit as well in the discussions with the EU. I mean, the EU has hardened its line considerably on Beijing, partly because of their own experience, particularly with critical minerals and other Chinese abuse of trade practices, but also because of one eye on Trump, because this is an important element in Trump's negotiating with third countries, is that they are increasingly wary in their dealings with Beijing. So for all those reasons, I think that China's attempt to talk up the economy, to present itself as being more resilient, to present its technology as being world class, and in many respects it is. But the implication that they're able to stand on their own feet in terms of innovation, I think that's overdone, and I think that the Chinese economy remains extremely fragile. The property crisis continues. Wasteful investment in infrastructure has fallen. Local government debt is soaring. Employment is an issue, particularly youth unemployment. There are multiple issues facing the economy. And I think for all the efforts by Xi to talk up the economy, there are real issues there. I think as well that he's presenting himself now, Xi, as a champion of free trade, as a champion of globalization, calling for world unity against this sort of wrecking ball coming from Washington. But I don't think that really washes with a lot of countries which have had experience of dealing with China over the years, because China is the master of economic coercion. It's been part of the economic model for decades, even more so under Xi. I mean, they are the masters at weaponizing and using trade, investment and market access as means of coercion. So yes, Trump is hemorrhaging trust among allies and trading partners, but Xi's issue is there was never much trust in the first place. And so it's very difficult to then turn around and say, look, trust me, let's all band together against Trump.
Yeah, well, you touched on one thing there where China seems to have got the United States at least worried, because we had Donald Trump trying to make this minerals deal with Ukraine. And he started talking about rare earth minerals, and you talked about critical minerals there. And China, over the last week or so, seems to be restricting the supply of rare earth minerals to the United States in particular, and other countries, but ones that the US defense industry is wholly reliant on. And that will impact the US defense industry, their ability then to support Ukraine and Israel and other conflicts and their own needs as well. Is the restriction of access to these rare earth minerals that China has got a controlling a lot of control over from the economically viable mines around the world, is that a sign of desperation from China if you're getting into things that are that small economically?
I think in the medium term it could backfire, because there's been a lot of talk over recent years by more far-sighted policymakers and others about the reliance on China for multiple essential goods. And critical minerals, rare earths, have been at the foremost of these warnings. And the liberal democracies have been late to take account of that. And I think that China's use of critical minerals as a bargaining factor, restricting access, almost brought the German car industry, for instance, to a standstill, now targeting US defense firms, has been very effective. But it's rather like when you blow a zero day, a weapon in your cyber arsenal. That's it. You can't use it again. I think from the point of view of Western Europe or the United States, it's been quite useful because it's shown the danger of dependence. And I think that now countries are scrambling to look at alternative ways of getting those supplies, because we should remember that while it might be called rare earths, I mean, that's a scientific term, they're not rare. These critical minerals in general are available quite broadly. It's just that China has built an unassailable lead in the supply chain for these, and they dominate the processing of these minerals, which is actually a pretty filthy operation. It's one of the reasons why the West was quite pleased for so long to let them get on with it, because the amount of environmental degradation that China was prepared to stomach was far higher than would be the case in a liberal democracy, where it just simply wouldn't be accepted. So there are real obstacles to creating a rare earth, a critical mineral industry. But I think that China's weaponizing that we've seen over recent months has been a real wake-up call, and in the short term, in the medium term, will probably backfire against them.
Interesting. So do you think that China, Xi Jinping was concerned about Vladimir Putin's ambitions to recreate the old Soviet Union again, and therefore have that massive power base that there is, and therefore what his policy is with Russia is really to try and keep it in a weakened state so he can see it as a junior partner in a more aligned multipolar world with China at the center?
Yeah, I mean, they both talk about multipolarity, and for which I normally mean anti-American. But yeah, I mean, China sees itself as the dominant partner. It would never say that, but I think by its actions, it is clear that it is now immensely more powerful than Russia in that partnership. What intrigues me is the clash of these imperialist visions, because they are contradictory. They're both visions of recreating past greatness. Vladimir Putin has the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, recreating the Russian-speaking world. Xi has a China dream, which some of the more forthright nationalists in China regard as recreating the Qing dynasty. They both regard pesky little countries that want self-determination, whether they're Ukraine or Taiwan, as being rather a nuisance and being rather insignificant, whatever their population want. But of course, people forget that while China bangs on about 100 years of humiliation, about unequal treaties, the most unequal treaties and the most humiliation came at the hands of Russia. Certainly in terms of the amount of land that was grabbed from the Qing dynasty during the 19th century, and vast areas north of the Amur River, the Far East, the Russian city of Vladivostok, Sea Cucumber Bay, as it's known in Chinese. And Russian nationalists haven't forgotten this. Chinese nationalists, haven't forgotten this. And Chinese maps have to show the Chinese names of these old areas and provinces. So here you have two imperialist visions, which ultimately potentially could clash. Yes, they will say we've settled our borders, but in the minds of nationalists on both sides, it's never settled. The Chinese and the Russians are thinking very long term, but that gives us something to talk about next time. Ian, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Times Radio Frontline. A pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.